All right, welcome to this week's presentation. The world is heating up, and there's a lot of very important battlefronts, battle points, a lot of interesting zones of potential for good and for bad. And with the drama just peaking the way we see it, both within Yemen, within the obvious thing that's in everyone's mind over the past 100 days regarding the potential danger of a major war unraveling due to the insanity being unleashed in the Middle East, specifically against the people living in the Gaza, but also in the front on the Eastern European front, as well as in Taiwan. There's all sorts of trigger points. We see great breakthroughs on the multipolar alliance where there actually are adults in the room, thank God, that are making mature decisions about the future of the species. That is very, very heartwarming, but at the same time, there is a lot of insanity. The depths of evil go very, very deep, and the sophistication of the operations of this oligarchical parasite are something that people haven't thought nearly enough about. I know one person who has thought a lot about this is Joaquin Flores. And Joaquin is always approaching his geopolitical analysis that I always appreciate from a very, very informed basis of understanding historical context, some deep matters of philosophy that he's thought about more than your average person, let's just say. And so I really, really was grateful that Joaquin, even though he's sick right now, decided to overcome the bodily ailments and engage in a discussion with all of us. And like usual, what we'll do today will be a brief presentation, a brief geopolitical sort of overview based on what Joaquin has been thinking about, looking at, and wants us to think about as well. And then we'll just engage in a sort of casual back and forth for about an hour, hour and a half. And then again, for sympathy out of Joaquin's need to overcome whatever is plaguing him as far as this ailment,
Upper respiratory infection.
Yeah. And we'll end after about 60 to 90 minutes. So with that, Joaquin, thank you so much. The stage is yours.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to do Rising Tide Foundation. I think when I said, I'm going to do Christmas, we're going to have a family thing. So it was kind of the end of December. My mom came, visited. And so for all those reasons, and I guess for some reason, January happened to be the month that numerous pieces of proverbial excrement hit a couple of different fans globally, and one of the things that I think stood out the most, and that I've had taken me the longest to sort of wrap my arms around, has been the exchange between Pakistan and Iran. So this is one of the very big global hotspots, and it's very difficult, and why we know that despite there being very good reasons, not just for optimism, but there being like clear ways that we can confront what is happening, it is important to understand that what is happening are the warmongers trying to globalize the conflict. Globalize the conflict that you could say really began. Yeah, it's almost hard to pinpoint, but you could take your pick really between Ukraine or Syria, Syria 10 years ago or so. But whether you want to say that the war in Ukraine is a globalization of the Syrian conflict, or if you want to say that the Arab Springs were meant as part of a rimland, like to put a curtain of instability around the Russian Federation. All of these different conflicts and things that we're seeing are singularly related. These aren't random. They're not disconnected, and they're not just loosely connected. They're directly, very intimately connected. And so for that reason, we can say that this is a single conflict that is globalizing. And such as always, there was a idea, you see, coming out of the theoreticians of what's called globalization or globalization theory, And one of these was that globalization would lead to a decrease of conflict. And why was because, well, conflicts that would increase in any particular part globally, would necessarily globalize. And so since all the adults are in the room and everything, and since, everyone has got good intentions, certainly that will never happen. And so globalization is a good thing because certainly the globalists aren't going to threaten their profit margins by doing things that are going to, and I'm being facetious when I say this, of course, because the opposite turned out to be true. But the wrong thinking would be that the globalists would never do this because why would they endanger their supply line security? Why would they endanger their profit margins, the predictability of their operation? And and so globalization was trumpeted as a model that would be preventative of war. Yeah. Almost on the same line of thinking as too big to fail. Like this is a global network now, a market capitalist, so-called market driven network, which is really fails, I think, the definitions of both in many ways when you deconstruct them. But they're certainly not socialist or anything redistributive in any kind of grassroots or bottom up way either. So it's almost like we've got the worst of both worlds in this kind of Western global system. But clearly the globalization of conflict is something that they said would necessarily happen in their model. Now, they said that because it was so unlikely, or that because the players wouldn't allow it to happen, they were selling that as a plus. They were selling that as insurance against conflict, that globalization meant peace. So we're seeing now that actually that wasn't the case. And I think that the ideology of growth, the ideology of the Western model has suffered tremendously. I would just say, like in concluding this point, that when you compare the things that the United States is saying to the things that the UK has been saying, they're very, very similar. And when the UK would say them, people would say they would be worried that the US might act based upon the things that the UK was saying, but there wasn't tremendous concern with direct UK activity in the military sense. Nobody wants to be under full Western sanctions, but the idea that Britain was the military threat was not something that countries really considered in a serious way. But now we've reached, and people in the UK are aware of this, now we've reached a point where the US can they damage people? Can they damage property? Can they mobilize across oceans to a certain extent? But the degree to keep that up and the issues relating to their own supplies have been highlighted very boldly in the conflict in Ukraine. So when you put all these factors together, it's not a surprise that in Yemen, that Ansar Allah, so-called Houthis, are firing at ships that are registered, to being products, either the U.S. or Israel, France, etc., whatever it is. Clearly, the UK as well. Clearly, countries are seeing. We saw the activity not long ago with Venezuela. So clearly, countries are, the word you could say, and I don't like word that's so polarizing, but you could say these countries are emboldened. They're emboldened by a series of, not even a series, but a whole process of imperial decay, imperial collapse, yeah, within the U.S. empire. And so within this vacuum, the space has emerged for local hegemons to flex. And you've seen, we could go through a list of local hegemons that have flexed. That would be going down like too much history, because that's been a process like for the past 10 years. that you can see countries flexing, but definitely the Ansar Allah in Yemen definitely flex Iran in striking multiple countries simultaneously. Experts believe now that ballistic missile was used on the U.S. base in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Erbil, and this was a giant military intelligence facility. So what the Iranians are really egging on, and what will be, I think, the show that the British and the U.S. are extraordinarily reluctant to give Iran and the world, but that Iran is able to deliver such a show, would be for the U.S. to deploy serious naval contingent to the Strait of, let's say, Oman, something like this. The Iranian special forces have been showing for almost 10 years how the coordinated use of retrofitted speedboats used in the swarm can take down carriers, frigates, all sorts of naval material, and they show that the speedboat and the teams operating the boats, if you have a dozen, 2 dozen boats out around a single frigate or something like this, that it's very hard for the Marines or the sailors on the boat to target and pick targets, and for that each target that they're dealing with to be meaningful. When you have multiple targets that are all each of the boats is equipped with a guy that's got basically a handheld system that can work either as surface to surface or surface to air. And this thing could take out a fighter plane, helicopter, no problem. And they can take out, they can put holes in the sides, very big holes in the sides of any American warship or carrier from handheld devices. So it's pretty intense. The change in the military doctrine, Iranian naval military doctrine. And now, Matt, now that in the next, 1 year, I would say maximum, Iran is going to be showing off a whole fleet of these same boats equipped similarly, but entirely unmanned. So now what are you going to have when you have speedboat drones you see in the Strait of Oman or anywhere else? I mean, just talking about, the Persian Gulf generally, let's say, or in the, what about Iranian presence, naval presence, in the Mediterranean, vis-a-vis Lebanon? So there's lots of ways that these changes in Iranian military doctrine and what they are, I mean, they are aching to show how this works, because in a sense, you could say the stock value of U.S. military might is going to go down even more. The perceived ability of the U.S. to act decisively, effectively, and that it has the latest or next generation stuff as an advantage, that's already evaporating as we speak across the battlefields in Ukraine. But to see this happen on a level of the Navy, this is the next big shift in people's thinking. Like what I'm saying, anyone else could tell you. I didn't come up with this. This is not really my background. This is my research into the subject. People more competent than myself that are military scientists are talking about this for quite some time. Iran's approach with speedboat and naval battle spaces. So that's really huge. the Biden was just asked recently, and I know there's some questions, but and I want to take one as soon as I can, but Biden just said recently he acknowledged that the strikes on Yemen have not been effective. Um, and but said something very strange. He said, "Are we going to continue them?" Yes. Okay. Um, in the conflict in Ukraine, I think folks may know, but generally speaking, the Russians, I think everyone would acknowledge now, are advancing on multiple fronts and um, are making progress in all of the places that they're targeting for that. And I know that that's circular, but just to be clear, um, and that has changed very much. Like the Western media talk about stalemate. Like we got off of the stalemate stuff very fast. We went into December talking stalemate. We did a lot of talking about, I'm mocking Western media talking points. Like we did a lot of this kind of dance around stalemates, and then no, we're not. They're not playing anymore. It's they're done telling a story about anything. It's very clear that they just need $60 billion. Ukraine needs $60 billion, and without that, all we're seeing is a very guaranteed slow grind. People are talking about the status of Kiev or whether, Poland, how to what extent they should mobilize about 300,000 soldiers uh, to the Ukrainian or Belarusian border. So, yes.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts here. I would say I got a quick question I'll just throw out at you first.
Yeah.
And there's so many questions I have that I'd like your take on. The one there's Bill Browder recently just wrote an interesting piece, basically warning that or suggesting that as an insurance policy against the potential election of Trump into the presidency, that there should be a preemptive stealing of the $300 billion of Russian assets in order to assist the freedom fighters, in their continued fight to save the world from Russia's desire to annex the world in Ukraine. Um, what do you think of Bill Browder's influence and suggestion? And would this not also blow out the U.S. economy if like the world would just completely lose whatever dwindling faith they have in the U.S. dollar if this theft were to occur? And also, do you think that yeah, I'll just stop it with that.
Yeah, we just look at what Trudeau did to banking in Canada
Yeah.
with the politicization of that, and that's just a very small, very small sampling. But all of these things are connected, and they have all these things in mind. When I think about people like Browder, the first word that comes to mind is sociopath or psychopath or something like this. For folks who may not remember, this is someone who was doing equities and hedge stuff in Russia, who came in with a total loot and pillage mentality. He's the personification of Russia's demographic collapse. Like he is the devil incarnate. This is someone who, and he is so, his mind is so deformed. His consciousness is so moribund, and he's where he's at with this is that he insists that he was the good guy. I mean, it's not even like, oh, he's misunderstood. I mean, he doubles down on, he just totally deflects. It's totally he was there to save Russia. Those people who call grandma and say, hey, put all your pension into the lottery. That's Bill Browder, right? So he was calling up Russian grandmas, and um, and so he thought that was saving Russia, not leading towards its, not part of its collapse. So Browder is someone that when we listen to, we understand that uh, everything he says is going to be like the opposite of truth, kind of thing. So, right.
Right.
Now, so the there's been talk for a long time about what to do with this 300 something billion dollars that was seized or that's been frozen, that's Russian assets that when the conflict began, they froze it. And I thought about this for some time, and I thought, this is money this was Russia's money that was, it's money that it was for deposits and actually for gas, and it was their money. It was a sovereign reserve currency, and it was kept in a European country, and so and this was actually done on purpose. And when you understand, like when you get to the mechanism of how that worked, right? It's a little bit like the money, a little bit worked in the model of a very traditional hostage, like in a medieval type of concept of a hostage, where like a relative of a royal family goes to stay with a potentially hostile other family, and he's their hostage, but they treat him like a guest, and he lives like one of their, he doesn't live in a cell or something, So this is like money that Russia had some understanding that in the event of some, geopolitical cataclysm such as war, etc., that this is something they would have a very difficult time getting back. Yeah. I think when you look at the math, Russia's already done that 300 billion. I believe that they have that now solidly back. When you look at now in terms of when the 20-something% of Ukraine that Russia has is equivalent to between 50 and 70% of former Ukraine's total GDP. Certainly when you talk about a $300 billion investment, you're going to see it in there. Okay. I hate to be Machiavellian in my description, but I understand that Russia worked through those steps and like arrived at some kind of calculus about costs and stuff. So I think for what it's worth, the West can do whatever it wants with that. But what they've said, and it would have no effect on Russia, is my point. But to your point, in terms of the West or other countries, right? This would, as you're suggesting, and I think that's spot on, this would precipitate, a quickening of just huge levels of distrust and inability. This is going to reveal that they politicized the one thing that it used to be, and we all know differently, but it used to be the one thing is that the dollar was not politicized, and that the one thing that the U.S. cared about was investments, and the one thing that was, for all of the criminality and the oligarchy and everything in the West that you could criticize, the one thing that you could say is that, Swiss bank accounts are bulletproof. The one thing that you could say is that, yes, but in this system of inviolable private property, if you are one of those owners of property, they're going to, the police, the courts, etc., the laws exist to protect your property rights. Like that's the kind of how the deal works in the West. So that's important for Saudis. That's important for lots of people. That's important for Colombians. That's important for the Chinese. It's important when they see this talk about, oh, we're just going to take the assets of people. It's the focus on the 300 billion is important because it gives us we can talk about, well, there's been many other things against the properties of Russian citizens, like just if they're in Europe and with a car with Russian plates, there's countries that are seizing, they're just treating individual civilian, non-military Russian people who happen to be of Russian descent that might have a second Russian passport, or their brother-in-law's car's in the country and it's got Russian plates. They're seizing these things. So this is actually as much in this court of whole environment. It doesn't make Russia look like it's getting contained. It looks like Europe is getting contained. And I think that once people see it through the lens of Europe is getting contained, it's going to change a lot of attitudes. Like you're not winning anything, you're not defending anything, whatever values, concepts, abstractions. Germany is paying 1.7 times the median energy costs of G7 countries, Matt.
Mm.
They can't produce. They can't produce now. So yeah, Browder suggesting to seize this money, and there's been there had been, forgive my inability to articulate this, but what I'm trying to say is that through the whole duration of the conflict, they were talking about this like it could only be a good thing. Now, as this idea has come back again into the limelight, Matt, like we're seeing very strange press suggesting that it could have negative consequences from mainstream publications. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece saying it was a bad idea, and some others. So for Browder to say this, he's always been on the wrong side of history. So I'm happy to hear him say this. It makes me think like it might not happen, but it would be, you know. But then I'm never. It never fails to amaze me the things that these elites have done in the Western countries that seem to, undermine their position or seem to, shoot themselves in the foot or cut their nose to spite their face. I've seen this happen, and others connect some of these acts of apparent self-sabotage to things that they're connecting in, let's say, the Great Reset. So maybe we want to do something bad. Maybe we want people to lose confidence in the dollar as a reserve currency. Maybe we want people, there's many different theories out there. So, but those aside, and just in a very milquetoast kind of straightforward way, if Browder is saying it, it makes me think that it's not going to happen. The the articles now talking about how the European how is saying clearly that there's no mechanism. Like, how is that a check? Like, how do we get that to you? And who does it go to? You know, is that how do you spell, is that Zelensky? Is that with two Y's? Like, how do we write this check out? And who does it go to? And things like this. It's very weird articles people should get into, but they're talking about now why that is not even legal. And it's like, wow, it's very strange to be talking about what's legal now, dude. Like now we're in 2024. So, but it's a very good question, man. Browder, it always cracks me up.
Yeah, he's sort of this
Browder.
walking, like you said, a Mephistopheles, but a foolish, like low-level uh Mephistopheles character who just, yeah, he's a strange psychological case. But no, thank you very much for that very contextual answer. And I've got a few other questions, but I'm gonna withhold. I know that Peter's been waiting for a while with a question, Jerry too. Peter, are you still there?
Yeah, definitely here. Good to see you again, XF.
Hey,
Oh,
what's up, people?
great to see you. I got several questions, but I don't want to hog all the time. But there's you led off with Iran and Pakistan, and I'm wondering, can you comment on the missile exchange between the two nations and any possible relationship with Major Ralph Peters' 2006 Middle East map showing predicted significant changes in the borders between these two nations?
Yeah, well, there's definitely contest over Balochistan region and others, and AfPak in general and Iran's relationship to AfPak and Iran building up its assets throughout AfPak is a well-known phenomenon for some time, and research white papers of this kind talking about change of the maps is the most direct way to put it, is always going to include geopolitical conflict. You can see sometimes these things when they come in the form of forecasts long before you have, like we have now, we have a broader context of how that can be materialized. It's possible for some of these things need to be arranged, are the pressures are such that you can either change the borders or change the demographics there. And changing demographics is a polite way to talk about population exchanges, which in turn is a polite way to talk about forced removal of human populations from a given geography, which is a polite way to talk about certain types of genocide. So interestingly is that there's been conflict within Pakistan between its what we could call its deep state and its civilian government. Well, you had the Musharraf coup. And even back then, this is going back, 2001, 2004. Gosh, forgive me, but this was at this time, um, there had been there had been forgive me, I don't remember the name of the family, but there had been a very prominent opposition family in Pakistan that had been by and large the US's primary asset that it had been fostering through the 90s. But instead they came in with Musharraf. That's good. So that was a very, very strange thing, number one. Now, into the present time, understand that many different in Pakistan, you have a number one, a tremendous Chinese influence. This is in no particular order. So I say just number one, just as a list, but this is not a prominence. Tremendous US influence, tremendous Saudi influence, tremendous Saudi influence. Now, around the time that Khan comes into the presidency in Pakistan, or the executive position in Pakistan, you begin a rapprochement between Iran and Pakistan. And this was seen, you had number one, security agreements. Number two, they had mutual drills. They agreed on actions needed to be taken with regard to the groups in Balochistan for sure, and also pro Sunni groups in Pakistan that were whose activities were on the border and aiming at raiding into Iran. So they had mutual interest, but what I'm trying to talk about, and why I mentioned the coup back 20 years ago, and where the U.S. was in that coup, is that the old dynamic of Pakistan sort of being religiously, this is kind of strange for people who don't know it very well, but religiously, Pakistan just is very close to Saudi Arabia. Just to understand, Pakistan religiously is very close to Saudi. Of all of the countries in the world, in the Ummah, in the Islamic community, who are Sunni, there are no two Sunni countries whose view of Sunnism, in particular the Salafism of al-Wahhab and the Wahhabi line of Sunnism, is appreciated in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis look to the Saudi Wahhab clerics as the fount of their for Islamic jurisprudence and other and cultural and historical approaches to Islam as well. So now, going back to the Sino-Soviet split, you'll recall that India had the relationship with the Soviets and Pakistan had the relationship with the Chinese. So this Chinese relationship with Pakistan didn't go anywhere. Okay, but what did go somewhere is China's relationship with Russia. So now you have kind of like this India, Russia, China, Pakistan thing. Well, you also have like a Russia, Iran thing, and a China, Pakistan thing. So with the coming of Khan, we saw all of this. So we mentioned the military agreement, anti-terrorism. So we had the drilling, anti-terrorism agreement on the need to do things to reduce the potential of these groups that both countries mutually recognize were problematic to each other. Okay. And then we had just recently a coup against Khan. And we would be remiss not to include that the events that we're seeing now with Pakistan and how it's entangling with Iran would not be at the scale, or not possible, or not happening if it wasn't for the U.S. getting their guy into Pakistan just some months ago, probably illegally. So there was a coup, in Pakistan, and coups lead to conflicts when normalized politics was protecting a status quo based upon you would call normality. So, which is not war. So yeah, it's but in terms of now whether there, to what extent what Iran and Pakistan was doing, or what they were doing and firing at each other, like to what extent it was actually hostile to the states, where those bombs landed. And there are always conspiracy theories to even to what extent that it was possible that Iran and Pakistan agreed before things even were fired off, that to what extent things would be limited, and even further extrapolations on the potential of any coordination and what happened there. So there's lots of room from my perspective right now, just open-minded. I'll eventually arrive at some conclusions, and then I may be less open-minded, but at this point in time, I just haven't put the study into it yet.
No, what I really like about you, Joaquin, is you really demonstrate how to withhold judgment until facts can be properly assessed, which a lot of people, we all like want the right answer. We're sort of mistrained in our modern school system to get the right answers as quickly as possible, pass the test. And that's not the way the mind works when it's actually trying to develop a proper hypothesis, especially for something as multifaceted as human dynamics. You really have to really withhold some final judgment. Although it doesn't mean you shouldn't be hypothesizing. There's obviously, I can see clearly in your voice that you're leaning towards certain hypotheses, but you could be wrong, right? We have to always have that discipline to be humble and to be self-inquiring. So that's great that you're very transparent about that. On that note, yeah, I still have my question that's also going to be an ambiguous question, but Jerry, I'll give Jerry the satisfaction of asking a question first on the Asia pivot.
Oh, thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
Hello, Joaquin. I wanted to get your thoughts about the situation with China. And I've been reading articles lately about, they call it a pivot to Asia, with people around Biden. And I know the real crazies in the United States want to have a war with China. And I think they're trying to figure out a way to pull away from the mess in Ukraine so they can do it. I mean, they can't even get Congress to pass the funding for Ukraine now. But now they also have this Israel Gaza war, and the US has to find Israel to keep it going. And I can't see this pivot to Asia happening. And also, if the crazies in the US so miscalculated on what would happen in Russia, I'm just thinking their miscalculation on China is going to be even worse. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on this so-called pivot to Asia, and if they can actually get a war going with China.
Yeah, I think that your general sense, right, when you're looking at how these same crazies, the neocons, the crazies, Team B, are how they misapproximated Russia so severely, that there's obviously some other metric that they use, or the metric they have is just non-functional. I would articulate by design it's non-functional, so there's some other purpose that it serves. And then wouldn't they be also disastrously wrong on China, you know? Now I would say, yeah, generally you've got it. I mean, it sounds strange to think about a pivot to China. This is something that Obama was talking about, Clinton was talking about the Pacific pivot. So this is rehashed language. You know, this is like, this is something which never took off. And it never took off because they can't fool anyone. You know, what you're going to convince, you're going to convince Russia that now we're sorry. Oops, you know, sorry. And then, but we need you to, you know, see China as the enemy. And what, in exchange, what? There's going to be, you're going to have access to all of Europe's, you know, what, 100 million people that can still afford to buy things out of 600, 500 million people. Yeah, 20%. That's about 100 million people. Or what? Americans who, those of us who, I guess, still buy things. Yeah, I hate to say it, but Europe and the U.S. are in perfect positions to become production economies. You know, they have nowhere else to go but to become productive production economies. The idea that you're going to pivot to China, this was stuff they were trying to do with, you know, they talk about this. It's funny when you say, like, I remember 2008, and you remember these position papers. You remember the first pivot to China. You can remember when Obama's Pacific pivot. All of these endeavors, you know, but it would always entailed some idea that it was going to be some Americans going over to some either Chinese or Japanese and telling them what to do. And I think both nations are done with that game. And it doesn't mean that Japan and China are right for rapprochement, but that is going to be the you know, the idea of like Japan and China having some economic and strategic cohesiveness is going to be like bigger than, you know, France and Germany becoming a single entity or something like that. You know, this is something that would, I think it's hard for people to calculate, you know, when you combining the potentials, and they have strengths in different areas. You know, Japan has a lot of experience and technique and the experts, and China's not lacking, but combined they would be virtually unstoppable globally. Not that they would want to be, you know, confronting people, but just in terms of the dynamic of that. So why am I saying this? So all I really see U.S. efforts in the Pacific are purely aimed at maintaining this divide between Japan and the direction of the region, basically. So to keep Japan at odds with the direction of the region. And I'm more concerned about when they talk about a Pacific, you know, because we had people like Shinzo Abe who just, you know, suddenly are no longer in office, you know, and these are people that had pursued, you know, anti-China rhetoric, and come out of anti-China secret societies, right? But their practical aims were to remove the U.S. from Japan. Yeah. So if the U.S. would have liked to have believed what he was saying, or to whatever deals they were trying to make, you could see that Japan was looking for a way that it could even become something like a Turkey, you know, that actually be a country that can not always make people happy, but people would see that Japan does things in the interest of Japan. You're generally right. Pacific pivots don't lead to anything. There isn't. It's so silly. I mean, when you look at the number of the U.S. doesn't even have a potential to mobilize its military into that part of the world. So what you're really talking about is, can you get a coalition of countries like, could you maybe get the Philippines combined with Japan? Could you somehow bring Indonesia in, or what about the ASEAN economic bloc? What are all these things that could be, angled against China? And these people just talk on these fantasies. See, when you dig in, you start looking at any of these different concerns. I mean, these consortia, investment and productive in the Indochina and Indonesia and in the Pacific Rim. Well, what you see time and time again is that it's irrespective of the political position governments involved, whether they love China, hate China, the Chinese are invested in all of these projects at some level. They're not excluded. There's nothing that's excluding China from anything in the Pacific Rim. One of the things that the Chinese identified had been the source of one of their downfalls in the past, because they're not surprisingly students of their own history. And it's a history that goes back thousands of years. So there's quite a bit to draw from. And one of their collapses was precipitated by the central government in China trying to have what's it called? A fee to play. If you want to sell to China, that you have to basically pay to play. And so what in the international arena, what XJP has been committed to is having that the roads that lead out of China also lead back to China as freely. So they don't want to create a system of basically toll roads, in connection with, we're taking the analogy of the Belt and Road project and to their historical example, you would say they don't want to be building toll roads, and that toll roads in the past were their downfall. Yeah, I think that's my answer.
Kevin Champagne, are you still there?
Yes. Thank you, Joaquin, for being here. I have a question about the topic that's been puzzling me a lot since the start of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I want to preface my question with a poll that I've seen on X. And it was a poll on the French Canadian side of Twitter. And it was made by an account that is, I would say, would be classified as the far right or whatever you want to call it, pro-Russia or whatever. And in the poll, there was about 300 persons who answered the poll. And they were asking, Kalza posted a meme oftentimes where you have a graph of two axes. You have the Russia, Ukraine, and you have the Israel, Palestine, and whether you fit in this graph. And the poll was about that. So there were four options. Where do you fit in that? And there were, of those 300 people, there were about 35% who voted pro-Israel, pro-Russia, and 55% who voted pro-Palestine, pro-Russia. And here's my question. What's been puzzling me is how is the West so, I wouldn't say confused, but so all over the place on the Israel-Palestine question? Because in the Russian conflict, it's anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine. Very clear, no questions about it. But when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's all over the place. In Canada, you have Justin Trudeau who's kind of playing both sides. Well, you have, of course, the Biden administration who's very pro-Israel, but he sometimes plays some cards on the pro-Palestine sides. Some have argued because of to get the black votes for the coming elections. Others have said other things. I just wanted to know your opinion on that matter. Why the confusion?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Kevin. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. So Chinese internet, I don't know if it's a political scientist or whatever, came out with a way of interpreting similar poll results. And this one was kind of like a 4-square XY axis with 4 quadrants, like a Cartesian. And it was like, pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, right? Sorry, pro-Palestine, pro-Ukraine, pro-Palestine, pro-Russia, pro-Ukraine, pro-Israel was another one, and there's the fourth, right? So the Chinese sociologists from that said, well, Americans that are pro-Palestine and pro-Ukraine are just a type of low information anti-warism. They call it low information anti-warism. They happen to be wrong about Ukraine and they happen to be right about Palestine. It's not the result of their own digging, but the result of the milieu and their sociological questions. What media they have access to, what demographic do they come from, what generation are they from in Democrats, in the US, are they Democrats? And we can say, like, are you from the US, or do you know what parties in the US have dealt with Palestine? A little bit.
I'm from Quebec, Canada.
Oh, okay, yeah, close enough. Yeah, so like Democrats, at the our political parties in the United States are big tent coalitions, and the Biden wing of the Democrat Party represents the mainstream, the leadership, so-called, as opposed to the activists in the party. And the activists in the party have changed, demographics have shifted over the years, but at the local party level and all of the major cities, or any places where you're going to have university students and things like this, and college towns and places that are Democrat strongholds for those reasons. They've been very, very consistent on Palestine, that they consider, apartheid state is Israel. They consider that this is an apartheid system, that it must end. And then people disagree. Is it going to be a one-state solution, a more democratic type of Israel? Do you change the name of the country? Do you change the flag? Is it a two-state solution? Like, people have disagreed on the solution end, but the general point has been that. So I would say that, like, probably 80% or 90% of the Bernie Sanders voting bloc of Democrats are pro-Palestine, just to kind of understand that. People who understand global geopolitics are in the position to understand what Russia is doing and where Russia is, and it's a different take. You have to have a longer memory. You have to follow news sources that aren't handed to you by corporations. You have to kind of search out your own information. And by searching it out, it does a funny thing. It also makes the information more real to us because we put the work into getting it. So yeah, that's a very interesting demographic disparity, like the overlaps and stuff. So I thought the Chinese sociologist Tim Kirby, do you know Tim Kirby, hardcore? Yeah, he actually was the one that shared that first, that the Chinese trying to figure out that those statistics that you were talking about, and they came up with basically that there are low information anti-war people. And I think I follow what that means. You know, the thing is that a lot of the people on Palestine, you know, were not low information on Palestine, you see, but the consolidation of the messaging around Palestine had, through the years of the second Iraq war, like 2005, 6, 7, like, you know, this, right? When you really got YouTube picking up, you really got smartphones with the first kind of video phones and stuff picking up. So people were documenting the stuff happening in Israel for the first time, and it wasn't just, oh, Human Rights Watch says, or some dissidents who are likely politicized people claim they were injured. You know, now we can see what the IDF and different more radical settlers have been doing this whole time, or at least during the times that things are happening, we can see. So that shifted a lot of people's thinking, first of all. Then you had Al Jazeera come in. So this was an important change in our perceptions because the BBC Middle East used to be based in Qatar, and it was run in coordination with the owners of Qatar, who are the same Al Thani dynasty whom the British installed and subsequent to their wars with the Ottoman Empire. So the relationship with the Al Thanis and the British are like that of the Al Sauds and the British. It goes back to the Great Game and the, you know, Lawrence of Arabia and all this stuff. So, like, a decision was made to end BBC Arabic or BBC Middle East in this way, and this was happening at the same time that Iran launched Press TV, that Russia launched Russia Today, and things like this. So Al Jazeera was launched around the same time, but it was not like these because this was an agreement between the British, MI6, etc., which 77th Brigade and British information intelligence networks, to outsource or to create it and have everything be there. Now, this did something really interesting because it allowed the British to work with the Qataris to produce certain types of documentary and news. You know, the neutral term is propaganda, but I don't mean that negatively, but, you know, to produce propaganda in the neutral sense that actually, while it showed the US occupation of Iraq in a negative light, and Al Jazeera worked diligently to acquire footage from locals, from activists, from people in Iraq, they were operating also as something of an intercept for things, and they were framing conflicts in post or in occupation Iraq with regard to, like, say, you might remember the Al-Mahdi army, and you might remember or Shalabi, you might remember the different characters and groups that the US tried to make its occupation work with, and some were quasi-hostile, and, you know, it was a very complicated thing because you had the Saddam loyalists who are kind of more like the secularists, but ethnically they're more like, you know, likely to be from Sunni backgrounds, of course, near Tikrit especially. region, city, town. But then you have Shias, then you have Sunnis that are actually religious. And so Al Jazeera was managing so much of the messaging. And then Al Jazeera was then in Syria during the Syrian war. And they were on the side of the US and Israel and Turkey and Saudi Arabia when they were all aimed at, remember, Assad must go. Remember, the Arab League removed him and everything like that. So Al Jazeera was producing fakes. Al Jazeera was involved in the chemical weapons hoaxes and the production of war porn, not literal porn, but I would call it the pornographization of violence. That I would say that it's always possible that it's used at any time, but I consider Al Jazeera to be fake news and a fake brand personally. And the fact that, it's the fact that Hamas is also based in Qatar and Al Jazeera is based in Qatar, and then you have everything happening there. There's just so many layers going on there. It's a very, 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 I haven't seen any evidence or it's seen a need for Al Jazeera in Gaza to produce fakes, but they're capable of it. But I don't think the IDF has been, and I say this facetiously, ungenerous with the opportunities for Al Jazeera to produce what you see as real. But know that this is an organization that produces fakes and produces fakes. So it's like, so Al Jazeera coming, as a source, and coming into, press and is it's a very, difficult. It's very difficult because it has, through multimedia presentations and through having journalists on the ground, they've done a lot of people, a lot of work for people that people would have had to do themselves, and people might have gotten similar impressions if they'd done the work themselves. But Al Jazeera puts on a plate for you. So it's a lot more, it's like, it's a product, it's a product that Al Jazeera produces. And it gives it a dimension of a problem there. And but what I wanted to say with that, and the reason that I said that, was that when you're looking at this kind of people who are low information news consumers, or whatever you want to call it, low information voters, low information poll respondents, or whatever. Al Jazeera has been, just as they were responsible for shaping people's perceptions of the Syrian war in a bad way. They've been responsible for shaping people's perceptions about the U.S. occupation in Iraq when it was, a more prominent thing, in a way that, again, was far more insight than you ever would have had, but it still had this angle of spinning the differences between the Sunni anti-occupational force versus the Shia anti-occupational forces in post-Saddam Iraq. Then when you get into the conflict in Syria, they're totally not giving accurate information. So what I would actually be interested to look at, right, in terms of, because we're talking about almost like Venn diagram of media consumer overlap and how do they fit in. I would bet my bottom dollar that people who support Ukraine and support Palestine are also anti-Assad and were part of Assad must go type of stuff.
Thank you. I'd read somewhere as well. I was trying to find it again as you were speaking of the BBC Arab Bureau in the 90s, which disappeared around the same time that Al Jazeera from its Qatar. I mean, it was based in Qatar, and Al Jazeera came into being with a lot of the same staff that oversaw the BBC
That's it.
Arab Bureau.
Yeah, they just handed it was the same building. I mean, they
Yeah.
didn't, nothing changed for them. They went to work the same place they always had. So
Yeah, just a total rebranding, right?
yeah.
Um, Paul, how many more questions do you have time for?
Like 3.
Okay.
What time is it now? Sorry, I don't. I'm just that was a PSA answer.
It
What
won't
time is
help
it?
you, but for me here in Eastern time, it's 3:14, and I think
Yeah,
uh
9. It's 9:15
seven
here.
hours,
Yeah.
6 hours. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I can do like well do one and let me give me one that you like and I'll see if I can be succinct and then
All
we'll
right.
see.
I'll be selfish. I'm just gonna toss out mine first. I'm gonna squeeze in there. The prerogatives of being a moderator. So Lavrov had recently said something which confused a lot of my contacts, and I mean, I get it. You can't ever really quite make a judgment based on what somebody says, but he said something that which was anomalous. Let's just say that, despite his criticisms of Israel in November, December, he came out saying a few weeks back that Israel's fight is the same as Russia's fight. I'm paraphrasing, but that just as we're fighting Nazis in Ukraine, Israel so too is fighting their own, Nazi problem in Palestine, and that was weird. I don't know if you saw that. Um, it definitely contradicts the general messaging from the Russian establishment regarding their perspective. Obviously, there's an intention to try to somehow get a two-state solution back on track. Was this, Lavrov playing soft cop, bad cop thing? What's up with that?
Right. Um, it's a little bit of that. It's been up until I would say that up until things really blew up with I was talking about since October 7th, right? When Hamas like did this huge staged attack, right? Um, what we have to understand is that like these types of big events and then like the leaders, really big things are said, then people kind of have a sense of, oh, this is kind of the face of things right now. Up until that moment, what we have to appreciate is that like the third most spoken language in Israel is Russian. It's, they're the most of the people that populate Israel from the demographic boom of non-Africans into Israel has mostly come from Eastern Europe and Russia. That was mostly in the 80s and 90s. And so uh, a lot of Russians or a lot of Israelis of Russian descent, moved there for economic reasons and the weather. They weren't particularly, Jewish in their practice or Zionist in their political sentiments. And they saw it as better than being in, the Soviet Union at the time. There was something called Operation Exodus, and yeah, Soviet Jews left Russia, Soviet Union, and went to Israel. Others went from Israel to the U.S. This was really big in the 80s, but so so Israel is a nuclear power, and the U.S. Uses the existence of Israel as one of its justifications to be heavily involved in the region. The truth is that even the Israeli establishment can see that the U.S. ability to project power in the region is going down every day. It dwindles. So My colleague Andrew Karipko years ago was writing about how Russia is a balancer of Iranian and Israeli interests in the region, that it's not promoting simply Iran's interests or Syria's interests over others. That's actually, by the way, a very British way of thinking about it. The idea that if you're not winning, that you're losing, and okay. Or that you're the way that you're building your alliances, or that you're balancing at the for the benefit of one at the expense of the other. Okay, and that this contradicts kind of win-win thinking that undergirds all of Russia's diplomatic efforts. Lavrov, first and foremost, is a diplomat, so his job is to say diplomatic things. It's, unofficially, Israeli PMCs, colonels, the Mossad, and others have worked directly and indirectly with the Kiev junta in Ukraine. However, officially and programmatically, the government has, in terms of its weapons, has not assisted Ukraine, has been, which is, again, not entirely true, as I just explained, but just in terms of the technical, here's weapons you can use, Israel has told Ukraine no on every occasion. And also, Israel has snubbed Zelensky a number of times, at times critical for Zelensky, and especially right after the October 7th attack, Zelensky wanted to go to Israel and, make this be part of the Ukraine story, which he could see the problem if he didn't, and he was right. But the truth is that Israel definitely sees that in the aftermath of 2015, 2016, the effectiveness of the Russian Air Force in Syria. Israel is not looking to have an enemy with Russia. They're having a strategic difficulty, we can say, but I think that there's very little chance that the millions of Israelis who physically live in Israel now are going to go anywhere soon. And there's going to have to be, the chance of the idea that the state of Israel is going to disappear without them using the 400 nuclear missiles that they have or whatever is another big question. So I look at this in terms of deterrence and diplomacy, but I think that if I recall correctly, wasn't Lavrov pointing out the way that it's perceived in the West, or wasn't this like a comment about how it's being treated by others, like through the Western lens? Maybe I misunderstood his quote also, but what my answer was not based upon a generous reading of his quote.
Yeah, no, I'll reevaluate the context of it, but what you've said is just perfectly clear. I mean, there's a language of diplomacy, and you're dealing with a psych case, so of course, you got to be very delicate when trying to walk this thing back from the edge. So, and the 400 nuclear weapons, or God knows how many nuclear weapons, at the disposal of Israel is a scary thing. It's a scary thing.
It is.
Yeah. All right, so let's get back on track with some people who have been waiting. Maureen has been waiting. Paul Gettle just had to leave, so I'll withhold his question for now. But Maureen, are you still there? Maureen, if you are there,
Yes.
you're on mute.
Yeah,
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I'm here. Thanks, Matt. I have a question. It's a bit off topic, but not really. It just seems to be something that's a bit hidden when you're looking at present day warfare. And I didn't know if it came across your radar, if it's something that, if it had come across your radar in different ways. there's something called GIG, Global Information Grid, right? And it's a American military operation. It's been going on for a while. It's a linkage of satellites known as the Internet in the Sky. And it's a basically it's a war net, would be a good way to put it. And it's a move towards network-centric warfare. So you can see that's informational, but it also seems to indicate, and believe me, I'm no authority on this. I have not done an in-depth dive into it. I'm very surface, but there seems to be a certain amount of, and this is global, this is a game that's not just played by America, but a move towards a kind of EM spectrum dominance, which would allow interruption of the communications systems that are planetary. So whoever has the most effective EM spectrum dominance can work most effectively to disrupt communication systems that obviously weapons systems are dependent on, because they're dependent on the EM spectrum. And so while this warfare, we're all looking down on the ground, it's potentially possible that we should be looking up in the sky. And the other thing that I find really, just my last point to connect the dots is Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book in 1970 called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Age in a New Technotronic Era. And he mentioned that a new system would emerge controlled by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values. Power will travel into the hands of those who control information, leaving less room for potential procedures leaving less room for political procedures as we know them. And again, this is informational, but if you control the skies, so to speak, and EM systems, then you control weaponry. So we're looking at potentially a very different kind of warfare from the fairly primitive warfare we're seeing occurring on the ground. So I just thought I'd throw that out there and get your take on that.
My colleague Leonid Savin has written extensively on net-centric warfare. He's written probably one of the more authoritative Russian texts on the subject of this net-centric warfare. I think one way to think about how you're seeing it in Ukraine right now is, let's say the way that you can think of it is like a guy has a cell phone and it's already got tracking his where his location's kind of GPS, but more encrypted GPS, let's say, but not in there he is. So it's his communication, but also his location. And then there's an event, a kinetic event, fighting, shooting, whatever happening where he's at. Okay. And the fact that that's happening is then communicated from his device in a more direct, like peer-to-peer way to other units, and other units in the vicinity are notified the number of people that that guy's dealing with, the number of units, what those units are, and then what type of what type of units would be ideal for responding to that based upon what's available right there. See, all of this is like real time. Just think about, for example, like when they talk about the Internet of Things, or like smart technology, like smart refrigerator, smart TV, smartphone, and in terms of like what food is in your fridge and like when do you need to buy more milk or something like that based upon how much milk in the fridge, your smart refrigerator senses. Okay, this is like with munitions, weapons, and stuff. So think about like the Internet of Things or like the smart appliances in terms of like warfare. So that's one way to approach like net-centric warfare. When you're talking about like electromagnetic, that's obviously going to be something that you use against. That's gonna, your use of EM, electromagnetic weapons, are gonna limit your opponent's ability to be using, a global information grid or real-time information that's being processed by computers that are local or are not, whose attentions are not divided or not from a big supercomputer, but many different computers that are talking to each other using the internet. Okay, so this is, see, once we get what they mean by gig and EM and net-centric warfare and these things, and once we describe them in terms of like, show me what that, like, what does that happen in the battlefield, like show me what that looks like, then you're actually like, oh, okay, these are things that you could even like imagine, for example, like in World War II or Vietnam, the guy with the radio, and they, where you basically, things that are third generation warfare, right? So where you have small units of people that are able to being in constant communication with radio, so you can fight in a different way because you can have platoons go fight and you don't have to keep track of your line or keep, it's not like warfare before radio. So gig and net-centric warfare are continuations of that same development that allowed for small contained units to be that the unit itself was in direct communication with a command structure, but also simultaneously in, peer-to-peer or, whatever, communications with, let's say, nearby units. Maybe you need some support or something like this. So anyway, Russia is the only country that's been able to show effective use of electromagnetic warfare and jamming of present generation technologies, whether it's Starlink, whether it's digitized encoded transmissions for we would call them radios, but they're not radios. They work like radios, but they don't use radio technology. But also all these are next generation, and Russians have been able to jam these in. The jamming of these communications was considered to be largely responsible for the failed counteroffensive. But I would also say that when people talk about like when people use words like integrated command and control, this is like synonymous with gig, and this is synonymous with net-centric warfare. So I think when you look at this, both sides have shown ability to do this. And based upon what they have, the Ukrainians don't have Russian technology on jamming, but just in terms of how I'm describing gig and net-centric, you can see both sides have used these basic principles or the reality of those technologies and how they work in the field has been seen, or when they're not available. Like think about the reaming that Elon Musk got from Zelensky or from Zaluzhny and others over the I guess accusing him of games with the Starlink system. So these are all connected to this. I don't know if there's like a more specific angle you were looking for or what, but yeah, those are my thoughts on the subject.
Paul wrote to me asking me if I could read his question out since he had to just depart a bit early, and I looked over his question. It's good. It's an interesting question. So yeah, I'll just read it to you. I know you're feeling sick and you're battling it out. You're doing well, but how you wanna make this the last question, or you wanna pull out another one after this?
Let's do the question, man. Yeah, let's do the question.
I see you're in the ring. You're duking it well.
No.
All right. All right. So Paul writes, historically, the overall strategy of trajectory of the oligarchy, has always been to take down any power center they could internally or externally from within or from the outside attack. So I expect that highest level of this oligarchy intends the demise of the U.S. power. Okay. So he says, my question is, what and where could we expect this oligarchy's power base to be when the U.S., I guess I'll say if the U.S.'s global influence is sufficiently weakened? I don't see it. This is similar to the oligarchy's predicament. Is this similar to the oligarchy's predicament in the 1930s? Are there weaknesses within the BRICS Plus or China or Russia that the oligarchy expects to exploit? Your thoughts?
Yeah, very good question. The idea that China was going to be the world leader in about 5 or 10 of the most important things was like obvious to like anyone looking at it since like the 1980s. So since then, equity firms, hedge fund, investment consortia have been trying to get deeper and deeper into China. Okay. They were trying to basically get so far deep into China that they could control China. They were right about the direction of China, and they were right about the direction of things in the West, and they've been writing it, and they've been in some way, trying to mitigate some of the contours of it so it works out for them in a more controlled crash landing demolition type of thing in terms of the society and the economy. But where that leaves them, they would have loved to be able to rebrand as Chinese, or they would have loved to have been able to integrate into some of these other structures in the world. They failed in this in many ways. The Chinese were, by the way, happy to receive foreign investment, but they had firewalls, and they have a party state. It's not just a society that you can buy your way in. They have the politics in China is in control of politics is in control of the political economy. So that's not to say that that people like Soros and others who had been talking up China for decades and had been acting as if they were like a Hollywood producer. They were overselling their role and aspects of China. It was almost like they were going to convince everyone else that they were the ones that held the keys to investing in China, not the Chinese. And so the Chinese, welcomed the dollars, welcomed the investment, but they weren't in the position, like messaging and connections and stuff, to I'm saying back in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s to like really directly take on this this is like like I said, like in film producers, like when they say, oh, we're gonna have this guy's gonna be in it, and they're trying to get you to be in the movie, so they're lying to you about other people that are going to be in it, but it's kind of a lie at the time they're telling you. But if you do want to be in the movie, maybe then maybe ultimately like they will get those other people in the movie. To you see what I'm saying? So it's all like it's like selling the Brooklyn Bridge. So they play a lot of this. They were playing a lot of this game. Excuse me, with China. Without a real way to show that they could actually control China. So, as I said before, the West is divided, and the U.S. and England are in a position through a number of ways. South Africa, India, prominently, okay, to get backdoor into BRICS. And from a backdoor into BRICS can bring the US into more harmony with BRICS, actually. Europe European oligarchs are the ones that are being left holding the bag. They don't have these. I'm not talking about the Anglo-Dutch. I'm talking about the Franco-Germans, the European Union, and then their subordinates, the Greeks, the Spanish, the Italians. They don't have a direct way into BRICS. So when you look at the conflict in Ukraine and the end games, there are scenarios where Europe is left really far worse off than post-war Ukraine. Why? Well, Ukraine gets rebuilt by Russia. Europe is then in some kind of state of permanent economic war with its adjacent bloc. So the main power base, the city of London, Washington, New York, Wall Street, militarily, they've had a doctrine that they will not allow on any given continent any bloc alliances. You're never going to see them allow or work towards, like we talked about, China and Japan. They're never going to want to see Iran, Iraq. They're never going to want to see, Europe and Russia or Eurasia. They never want to see Germany plus Russia or France plus Germany plus Russia. So largely these endeavors have failed. And you can only see that the war in Ukraine has had the worst effect on Western Europe. If you secondly, from the lives of Ukrainian people affected by the war, the most negatively affected by the conflict in Ukraine, you would think, oh, the Russians, right? Because no, it's Europe. So Europe is far more negatively affected from this, many orders of magnitude compared to Russia. Is Europe injured or hurt irreparably? They'll never, opportunity is lost. You never make that back. Like you can double the pace later. You're never going to make the time up. You're never going to make for lost opportunity. So that's huge. And so people have suggested in the past that China was their aim. And these were theories like in the 80s and 90s that I was exposed to. And conspiracy theories on the internet were still promote this to this day. But my reading in the subject, my cross-examining other experts in the subject, never led to some idea that there's some secret there's some secret place that they can go with capital or to reinvent themselves or something like this. Only BRICS, only only back channels through BRICS. It's obviously you have people like the Musk family, and they have all that mineral wealth from South Africa, and or what about the English in India? I mean, how many families in England still own important things in India? I'm sure it's still the few most important English families that own quite a few things, in India. So, in terms of natural resources and things like this. So, there are ways for it. It's going to be much more difficult for the French or the Germans to, they're the ones that are kind of between a rock and a hard place. So, immediately what that means is that accomplishes the U.S. goal of the revassalization of Europe. They're succeeding in that right now. European companies understand very clearly, just like how the war economy works, the real economy works the same way. It's like, oh, the US is actually excluded in effect from many of these sanctions that Europe has on Russia. And people aren't aware of that the US has created its own exclusions to many of the teeth of these sanctions that the US has Europe place on Russia. So think about think about, you might have thought of this as friendly competition, but think about a European firm and an American firm. Well, that are in the same business, excuse me. Well, now this creates like a much greater chance that the European firm is just going to become a subsidiary of the American firm, so they have access to the back door out of the sanctions, or even all the way into BRICS. So there's a couple of ways that Western elites have forward, but they're not going to be in control of China, and they're not going to. They didn't succeed in doing a 5-year lockdown program and a mass, drone production program and things like this. Those were things they would have loved to have had. Think about this war in Ukraine. They would have loved to have people on lockdown for a number of years. And then the big tech startup apps like Vault and Uber Eats would have been flying all these new drones into people's windows to deliver food during an extended, 2 or 3 year period. The drone economy would have exploded at this time and fit in exclusively tailored to the needs of long known needs of the US, which is to expand in drone production. We're talking about small drone production, like the kind you're seeing used on a regular basis in Ukraine. So I look at those kinds of things, and you can draw out maps of where the elites were thinking, what they had planned, where they were, and what they want to do with their money, and where they want to park it, or where they want to invest. And it's they have, the Americans, in summary, the US and the British have access to BRICS, and the French and the German and the European capital really has that access through the Americans. So they're revassalized in that process. Yeah.
All right, let's give up the last question to Peter.
Okay, I'm going to change gears a little bit on you, XF, and go back to some of your past experiences in California. Please identify 3 actions that working men and women in the United States can take to A, organize effectively, and B, organize independently from the Democratic Party.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Well, number one, what is organizing is pushing people, is leading from behind to act in their actual self-interest. Yeah. So this is like the opposite of manipulation, right? Because what's manipulation? Manipulation is pulling people, yeah, like from the front, you're pulling people to act in ways that are, fast for them until that are against their self-interest. You don't give them time to think about it, and it's not in their interest. So organizing, because the pedagogy and the education is such a big part of it, involves a lot of salting. Anyway, so concretely, identify the types of work in the country that can't be outsourced because of their direct physical nature to the direct service or the good that's produced here. Okay. But also, I think in general, the profitability of outsourcing to other countries is going down a lot. So there are some factors that work in favor of working class organizing in the US in the context of the rest of the world catching up. So that's been good. Where the Democrat Party has its stranglehold in the US primarily is over organized labor. And then second from that, there's a lot of small groups that are not connected to labor, that are, you would just call them pluralist institutions. And some of the things you might, Sierra Club or whatever, but some of them are very strange. And these represent, it could be, anything, but they represent more of the demographics of the liberal wing of the Democrat Party, the liberal progressive wing, as opposed to the labor left, right? So the labor left of the Democrat Party, though, they need all of those voters or they don't win elections, right? And this is happening mostly at the level of labor unions. So I'm an advocate of decertifying corrupt unions. I'm an advocate of organizing new unions. And this is not just for, I'm not saying, oh, and then politics and elections. No, we're talking about social change in society. And unions, labor, historically, is a proven effective method under certain conditions. And many of those conditions have returned. So I would say labor organizing, community organizing, and knowing what organizing actually is, like I started with. Now, politics is local, and the internet is weird because even though you have a greater chance to meet people quickly that you could identify with more readily along things that might be more complex or more developed in the arena of value, philosophical, or long-term aggregation of media or news information in very specified arenas, is very different from people that you meet in the real world. But people that you meet in the real world are sharing, physical spatiality with you, which means that in wherever you are physically, there are socioeconomic and political issues there. So those have to connect you. This is not about finding and building small hobby groups with people or affinity circles over great geographic areas. Those are very important. We have this here. We continue to build those. But where we live, over the issues that exist there, because people, whether it's the school board or the kids or the police, there's many things. And as every day as these issues are, these are the real ones, and these are the ones that connect people to the larger questions. I mean, think about the biggest pushback with the mask mandates or vaccine mandates, say, for example, was with parents in the school board fights all over many different, countries and jurisdictions. But we saw in Canada, in the US, like big fights. And that underscores the point I'm talking about the local nature of real politics. You know, labor and community organizing around real issues that are affecting you right there. That local leadership is either important in taking a first step, in taking the initiative, or in establishing that this is like the agenda of the day. How would you call it? Like that this is the issue, you know, even if at that level, maybe you need more like the governor or something like that. But local politics is a very important place in terms of building political power. So because the Democrat Party or any party is just a big tent, what we're talking about is what is that tent made out of? And the truth is that like the groups that are the groups that make up other constituencies of the Democrat Party are groups that base their worldview out of the privilege of not having to, or just from privilege. I mean, if you're an environmentalist, you could be from any, you know, background in life, and you could have good ideas or bad ideas. If you're an environmentalist that comes from a well-to-do time and place, you might not realize that the environment saving laws that you support are going to put more people out of work, you know, than anything else. That might not even seem to occur to you, and it might not occur to you, you see, because work and money has not been an issue for you. So you have such a broad and disconnected different coalition that makes the Democrat Party. You know, of course you're going to have the labor and productive economy unions, you know, electrical teamsters, builders, auto workers. They have been, you know, they are totally opposed to things like NAFTA, WTO, TPP. These are all things that Democrats have been pushing. Peter, it's like every anti-labor trade agreement that you could think of is the one that specifically, when you look what's going on, it's the Clintons, the Trudeaus, the Arderns. These are the ones that are promoting these. So what does that mean? And how is it that the spokespeople of labor are in line with the politics that destroys the foundation of a working class? And that's obviously, you know, the problem that we have. So what people don't always know is that all those people can be voted out, and it's actually easier to build power in your union and to change leadership in your union than it is to change leadership in your city or to remove a senator. You know, but people don't think of taking power of their unions in the same way. If you pay dues, you're entitled to file a claim with the NLRB, a decertification claim. This is not like an individual complaint. We're talking about you get a number of supporters going on you know, everyone get your signatures together, and you can actually take power in the union. People don't always understand how much money is in these unions and how much money disappears from these unions. Peter, if you have, just for example, 100,000 people, right, and they're paying $20 a month in union dues, right? So that's 10 times 100,000 is $1 million.
Yeah, you got
so that's $2 million a month, right? Just from 100,000 employees. So that's 24 million a year for 100,000 employees. You can do so much organizing with that. It is incredible. So there's such a big fight over unions. People understand how much money is involved. The dues that come out of workers' paychecks and go into the union coffers, and do Democrat senators at the national level have their hands? Are they getting kickbacks from Bahrain or from China or whatever? For sure, yes. But domestically, without the support of all those little $20 and $30 and $40 a month union dues, and without the get out the vote machine, the Democrat Party could not win in a single election. So yeah, if you want to, depending what your goal is, we could be answering any number of different questions: how to stop the Democrats, or how to reinvigorate working class militancy. There's actually two sides of the same equation. Yeah, it's really the same answer.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I just shared in the chat box a little I felt like the spirit of Paul Robeson was flowing a little bit there, and I shared a little YouTube song by Paul Robeson on Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, and a little anthem towards organizing, and
Yeah,
the spirit of what was
yeah,
really lost as far as like what makes democracy work, and like one of the best mechanisms for giving democracy the vitality or the possibility of expressing itself is through unions as the medium by
yeah.
which the individual can directly interface with making policy and wield power greater than the self.
Right.
Okay. And we've really like lost
Such a
touch with
huge
that.
thing. I mean, what you just said, that's it, man. I mean, think about, when the creators, conceivers, and drafters of our Constitution were thinking about the issues of enfranchisement and the issue of political power. The idea, at that time, this is at the same time historically that you had, Adam Smith writing about the wealth of nations and writing about, he gave the example of the pin factory being this kind of soul crushing experience where human beings are transformed into cogs of a machine. And he questioned whether that was really a good thing. He understood, though, that the wealth of nations did lay in the rise of what we now call the first industrial revolution. But what's so interesting about that is that as much as we understand how important that is, it's like as those companies grew in power, and people went from being landowners, people went from being sharecroppers, people went from being tenants and farmers, to being employees of big, giant companies with hundreds of thousands of employees. This was not a thing happening in the 18th century, but by the close of the 19th century, it was much more commonplace. And the idea that democracy, ends when you go into this facility, and the idea that here's this huge part of our society, and it employs millions of people, and it has tremendous political and economic influence over every outcome, whether from war to inflation to the decisions that the president makes, but yet that those companies who couldn't make anything if it wasn't for its million employees, the idea that those million employees don't have any say in that is crazy. So, I mean, yeah, the idea of industrial democracy is what we're talking about here. And this is an idea, it's also an American idea. And you had, anarchists like the IWW, Joe Hill, and you had, Eugene Debs and others. There's so much forgotten American history about this. And, it's important that we also tell the entrepreneurial and individual and freedom component of the American story. But we're going to get that story wrong if we don't understand that solidarity and collective action are just as much of American freedom and the American experience as the other. Absolutely.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, and I think just a lot of people have just become so demoralized, just like they have for the nation state idea, which is why they've given up on the idea of fighting to use the nation to defend us and to do battle with the oligarchy. So too, they've kind of lost faith because of the obvious corruption of the CIA
Yeah.
operation, the FBI, the Trotskyists who have been infiltrated into unions over the decades to like almost be to just like the nation state, right? To almost induce a lot of these things to become the embodiment of incompetency and corruption. And then people say, "Oh, see, the union is the problem." And it's like, wait a minute, what about the the FBI, CIA ops that
Right.
took over and infiltrated this thing from within? What about that? Maybe we should take
Yeah,
these things.
people, no, and then people are very interesting because they understand the FBI is the problem unless it's saying something that fits their whatever condition is. Like I was sharing recently your MLK piece about how not assassinating him a second time. And and it was people, someone didn't read it and they were like, just something stupid and smarmy, like, well, then why did the FBI have records of him doing blah, 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 blah? And it's like, you apparently just didn't get the assignment. The point is that the FBI makes this shit up whole cloth. They like invent it, they don't, So anyway, it's
Yeah.
the FBI.
Yeah,
Well, the FBI says
it's wildly ironic. I got that too. There's
FBI says that
so many
Oslo was corrupt.
conservatives. I know, and there's so many people, especially from the conservative anti-Great Reset bent, who understand the fraud of Russiagate, who get the how the FBI is their enemy, and yet as soon as you say something good about MLK, it's like, oh yeah,
Right.
but J. Edgar Hoover proved that he was a orgy, drug doing, Satan
Right.
worshiper. It's like, wait a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a project, a program they held called COINTELPRO. Yeah, and I mean they the FBI had leaders of the Black Panther Party hating each other. They had like leaders of the Black Panther Party thinking that they had written each other nasty letters. They were writing fake letters on behalf of other people and then causing fights between people. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's very good work that you did with that, and I keep sharing it. But it underscores the point about the stakes at play and the lengths that these people will go. Talking about the FBI to defame and to derail movements, to defame leaders and to derail movements. Absolutely, yeah.
Right. And you can see sort of another expression of that too with many people who tend to be on the right who were just before October 7th marching hand in hand with Muslims against the wokeism and brainwashing in the school system all across Canada. It was really bold. And then literally the day later, they're all like they're breaking completely apart, completely siding unquestionably with anything Israel does as being great because they watch Tucker Carlson or rebel media in Canada or something else. Or inversely, these same people are often also saying, "Oh yeah, the FBI and the CIA are part of the deep state to destroy and enslave us." But at the same time, what the CIA or the FBI is saying about, or the Five Eyes is saying about China taking over our government, and that we have to presume is true. That information is
Right.
fine. We should be afraid and hate China much more than and believe these patriots in the CIA or CSIS who really care about us for some reason on this point. And it's just like
Yeah. Yeah, you
dissonance.
can see who the gatekeepers and like you can see, and some of these Telegram channels out there too. It's like it's so conspiracy about the deep state and blah blah blah, but then it's sort of like, but yet all the same people that Nikki Haley says are the problem are still apparently the problem. So like North Korea is the bad guy, Iran's the bad guy. Very weird. What was he saying? Kevin's saying Islamophobia was. I've seen a couple of these great comments and the one before too. Yeah,
Mhm.
the Islamophobia, but
Yeah. It really is that.
yeah,
It
no,
really is like a little button, right? On
yeah,
on the machinery of the
they
zeitgeist.
have like it's the the gambling that they're going to be able to divide counter-hegemonic movements based upon everyone's disparate, interpretation of geopolitics. If they're gambling on that, they're not going to win. Um, people are fundamentally driven by the real issues that are affecting them and their family. What we are dealing with right now, like the awakening that we are in right now, is not a pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy of needs type of awakening. With the awakening that we're having, political awakening we are having right now, is not like the one that happened in the 60s and 70s. This is not one that's, now that we've got three, pots and a cot, now that we've got a roof, now that we've got a 9 to 5, now that we've got a stable civil society, okay, now we can, kind of begin to explore deconstruction of, typical roles of authority, blah, 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 blah. Like, this is not the awakening that we're in right now. Like, you're not going to be able to derail this awakening because, people are, akimbo over India, Pakistan, or Iran, or Israel, or Ukraine, or Russia. Like, there's a generation that was born after World War II that had the luxury to, to pin their sense of movement and value and historical, social, political righteousness on, the bumper sticker that said free Tibet, or, no more nukes against Russia, or whatever. Like, whatever it was that people had, it was always about someone else, something else, some other place. And that's so different. That's my concluding thought, Matt, is that what's so different about today is that people that are waking up and people that are getting involved, it's because of stuff that's happening to them and their family directly. This is not because they're in the position to be philanthropists with their life. It's not because now that they've got everything figured out, now they want to save the world. People right now are trying to save their families, and they're not going to divide. People are not going to get confused about Nikki Haley talking points or Israel, I think, in the final analysis. So it's but it's a very good observation. And also the one the guy was saying, was it Kevin, with the overlap between people that were pro-Palestine and pro-Ukraine. Like, that's also a very important thing to track. But yeah, that's my final thought.
Cool. Thank you, Joaquin. I'm gonna have the Eye of the Tiger playing as we end out the recording. No, this is actually going to be on YouTube. I am going to put Eye of the Tiger on for the recorded version on YouTube. That's going to go up.
Oh.
So thank you so much for pushing through your sickness. I really do appreciate you sharing this wisdom. Next week, we're going to have Gordon, my colleague at Badlands Media, who's going to come on and discuss the British East India Company in the Middle East, British intelligence warfare for, a few centuries back. That'll be fun next Sunday, 2 p.m. Until then, thank you enormously for this briefing and the insights that you Jerry, go for it.
I have the kids coming
thanks.
downstairs, so I probably only have a few more minutes before I'm going to get.
All right, so let's do a quick one with Jerry, and then
Yep.
Dave has a very, very short one afterwards on Kanye cities. So yeah, Jerry, go for it.
Okay, I'll try to be short.
Hey, Jerry.
Thanks, Gordon. I'm another big fan of you and Matt on Breaking History.
Thank you.
And the one you did a couple of weeks ago on Saudi Arabia and MBS and the Abraham Accords, I thought that was really good. And anyone listening who hasn't listened to that should go back and listen to it because it was great. But I wanted to ask you about Saudi Arabia and Iran, because I've really been interested in this since they kind of got back together with the help of China. And for me, if you just look on a map and you see Saudi Arabia and you see Iran, and in between is Iraq. And I think that's the key to the whole thing. And I know Iraq I don't understand it today. It's a mess. They have lots of problems. I mean, goes back to the invasion of Iraq, or even before that, to the 80s, the Iran and Iraq war, where the U.S. was backing Saddam Hussein. They were backing Iraq. But I just think that you'd mentioned there's talk about the US pulling troops out of Syria and also out of Iraq. And I know the Iraqi parliament passed a resolution calling for all foreign troops to leave. And I think if anything can straighten out that mess, it would be there. But I'm wondering, do you see something positive happening with Iraq because of this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Or do you think it's going to be used for some nefarious operation run out of the deep state again?
Well, it's a really good question. I actually think the problems with Iraq go back to World War I and the way that the boundary lines were drawn. That was actually a country that was supposed to be run by the Hashemites, and it was for a few years. But yes, the fact that they created this country that had both Sunni, Shia, Arabs, Persians, Kurds, like a large part of Iraq, like northern Iraq, is all Kurdish. The Kurds were completely disregarded when they were drawing up the national boundary lines. So you have a big Kurdish population in eastern Turkey, a big Kurdish half of Syria is Kurdish, and then you have northern Iraq are Kurds, and even like the very western portions of Iran, they didn't get their own country, and those are the people that typically are used as like the proxy militias to start these wars. So I think that I do think that the entire region is going to prosper. I think MBS's plan is for the entire region, basically for them to go through a renaissance and for the entire Middle East to experience like a European type renaissance where the rising tide raises all ships and everyone's going to benefit from it. I think it's going to be very confusing and convoluted up until like that moment where everything just kind of clicks and everything makes sense. But yeah, I think I'm being driven off. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question. That I think Iraq's going to be okay.
Yeah,
I think Iraq is going to be okay. So
yeah, there's definitely something very, very historic and that's sweeping across the world right now. And definitely there's a lot to hold on to. There's a lot of reason for reasonable hope. And Gordon, I think you've just gone through a really wonderful foundation building presentation. You've opened up a lot of doors for questions. We see that you have other fans that are pulling you in another direction. So thank you so much for taking the time very generously today, and thank you everyone for showing up for this this Sunday afternoon session. And we'll join back next week. Is there any final thoughts you wanted to throw out there, Gordon?
No, I sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but if you want to like email them to me or send them to me, Matt, if you want to gather them up, I'm happy. We can address them like on Wednesday's show, on Breaking History or whatever. So thank you for having me. Appreciate everyone's kind words, and thanks for watching.
Great. All right. Bye, everybody.
So much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Next week.
Bye.